Wonderful. Well, good afternoon, everyone. I am Laura Perez. I am a professor here at UC Berkeley, and I'm also the chair of the Latinx Research Center. And so on behalf of all my colleagues, the Latinx Research Center team, I want to welcome all of you here. We're really happy that we are co-sponsoring today's event, and we're really happy that we're going to be hosting numerous events by the ISSI in this space, and it will be full of a large and beautiful group like you today. So welcome here to the Latinx Research Center. I want to do a special plug and invitation. This Friday, we are having from 4 to 6 o'clock, we're having the co-sponsored reception of the Latinx Research Center for the fall. It's co-sponsored by the Chicano Latino Studies Program, by the Latinx Faculty Association, by Alianza, the Latinx Staff Faculty Association, but it's for everyone. And at 4 o'clock, the new UC Regents chair, John Perez, will be here. He will be addressing us for 20 minutes, and then he'll take a Q&A. It's a great opportunity for you to show up. He really wants to hear from the students. So it's a great opportunity. Tell everyone, come. You'll have the ear of the chair of the UC Regents, a powerful body on campus. As you head out, if you would like to take one of these fall semester flyers, please see my guest. Here's a flyer for the fall reception. I want to very specially welcome Professor Angela Garcia. I'm personally really looking forward to the presentation. And I now want to introduce you to Professor Tina Sachs, and she will be introducing our guest speaker today.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. Thank you for hosting us. Thank you for the lovely introduction. My name is Tina Sachs. I'm an assistant professor in the School of Social Welfare here at Cal, and I am the faculty director of the Center for Research on Social Change at ISSI. So we're so excited to have Angela here with us. Her talk is entitled Legal Passing, Navigating Undocumented Life and Local Immigration Law. And of course, we would like to thank our co-sponsors, the Latinx Research Center, the Center for Law and Society, and the Berkeley Interdisciplinary Migration Initiative. Before we begin, I would like to announce our next event, which is on Thursday, September 26th. It's entitled Freedom Farmers, Agricultural Resistance and the Black Freedom Movement, presented by Monica White. This event will take place from 3:30 to 4:30 in room 132, Mulford Hall, and we have flyers for the event available at the entrance. I'd like to ask all of you to turn off your cell phones. And so would also like to describe the format of this event. Professor Garcia will speak for about 45 minutes, and then we'll have a Q&A. So it is my incredible honor and pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Professor Angela Garcia, Assistant Professor in the School of Social Service Administration at the University of Chicago. That is also my alma mater, where I received my PhD, and so this is a matter of sort of the coast coming, the Midwest coming to the coast and vice versa. Professor Garcia received her PhD in sociology and her master's in Latin American studies from the University of California, San Diego. Her work has been published in Social Problems, Annals of the American Academy of Political and Social Science, International Migration Review, Ethnic and Racial Studies, among many others. Today's talk is also the title of her new book, which was published by the University of California Press this year. Garcia's research has earned awards from the American Sociological Association's International Migration section and the Society for the Advancement of Socioeconomics. Her current research includes a study that theorizes social time and the state from the perspective of undocumented immigrants who would have been eligible for deferred action for the parents of Americans, also called DAPA, and a collaborative project on Chicago's municipal ID program. We look forward to having her back to talk about those projects as well. Please join me in welcoming Professor Angela Garcia.
Hi everyone, good afternoon. Thank you so much, Tina, for that kind introduction. Thank you for everyone for being here and for Deborah for all the logistical help. It's really thrilling to give a talk on this book because it was just published in May. So now it's out and living in the world, and it's really fun to be able to talk about a thing that exists outside of my laptop And Tina has a great new book out on Black middle-class women and how they navigate the healthcare system, so I know that you share that sentiment of being excited to talk about a work that's a thing that one can hold in their hands. So thank you for the opportunity. I'm just going to jump right in. This is a talk that's based on a core concept in my book, which is titled Legal Passing, Navigating Undocumented Life and Local Immigration Law. And so I thought what I'd do is start with an excerpt from my field notes to provide kind of a motivating example of the material that I'll discuss with you all today. Barbara appeared suddenly in the cramped kitchen just after 6:30 a.m. Luz, her mother-in-law, had been playfully urging her to hurry and pulling together coffee and sandwiches. The pair had a long day of cleaning houses ahead of them. But when Barbara came into sight, Luz fell silent. Barbara was small. Her hair was pulled back into a braid that trailed down her back. She wore an old pair of jeans, a t-shirt with the name of a church group from her hometown, and a pair of sandals. Barbara thought she was ready for her first day of work in the U.S. She had just gotten here a few days earlier following her husband, who was Luz's eldest son. "No, mija," Luz said, her tone now serious. "We can't go out with you looking like that. The migra, or immigration enforcement, will see you from a mile away. Hurry now. Put on a nice shirt, clean shoes, fix up your hair. Hurry now." And in response, Barbara moved swiftly back down the hallway to change. Without a word, it seemed like she'd taken this initial lesson on life in her receiving locale, a city in Southern California with a slew of restrictive local-level immigration laws. She'd taken that initial lesson on life in. And so that morning that I spent with Luz and Barbara in Luz's home was the first time that I thought about the ways that undocumented immigrants navigate restrictive cities as a form of passing. So it's this behavior, a concept that I call in the book legal passing, that I'm going to focus on for today's talk. And so I want to turn now to the puzzle that I'm trying to understand through the book. And that is that we know that immigration status is a fully social and legal construction. At the same time, we know that it comes with very real consequences. Holding undocumented immigration status is connected to systemic disadvantage and negative long-term and intergenerational consequences. Scholars have come to understand illegality as a new axis of stratification that reinforces existing forms of social inequality. So given that, it's reasonable to expect that undocumented immigrants who live in destinations with layers of restrictive local-level immigration law would be marginalized, and that would be particularly true for non-white immigrants who are also racialized. In many ways, this advances popular media depictions of undocumented immigrant life in the shadows, with the curtains closed. At the same time, we also know that the general consensus across all the literature is that incorporation in many of its realms remains the dominant empirical pattern for all immigrant groups, including the undocumented. And if we think about incorporation as the decline of differences from ethnic to cultural to socioeconomic over time between immigrants and people born, in this case, in the United States. And we also know that immigrants exercise far more agency than the in the shadows narrative prompts us to expect. So from that puzzle, I'm trying to understand these kind of core questions in the book. I'm trying to understand how restrictive local immigration laws affect undocumented immigrants' everyday life, the way they navigate their everyday lives. And then I'm trying to understand what the connection is between those effects and incorporation processes. What I'll argue is that immigrant adaptation continues to unfold even in destinations with restrictive immigration laws on the books, and that the way that happens is a direct reflection of the punitive nature of these local level laws. This happens through legal passing, which I'll take a moment to kind of unpack for you now. Legal passing, as I talk about it in the book, is a strategy that immigrants use to navigate daily life in unwelcoming destinations. It's what I call a social camouflage that involves taking on the characteristics associated with the dominant majority population to obscure immigration status. It becomes internalized over time, and it incrementally and coercively contributes to cultural change. It distances people from their own national, ethnic, and cultural identities in service of avoiding being categorized as undocumented. So I want to give you a bit of background before I launch into where I did this work and my findings. Typically, when we think about immigration law in the United States, we think about things that the federal government does. And it's true that in our federalist system of division of labor, the federal government is in charge of things like exit and entry and the terms and conditions under which people can stay in the United States if they're admitted. But states and localities have control over what we call immigrant policy, and that has a lot to do with the rights and benefits that immigrants may access within their receiving locales, within their immediate destinations. And state and local level immigration policy is also not new. In fact, states and localities were practically the only source of immigration regulation until the 1870s in the United States. And if we fast forward to the mid-1990s, skipping a whole bunch of interesting history, that was a time when subnational or state and local level immigration policies reemerged. And in this last wave of immigration at the state and local level, we see at least three notable characteristics. The first is a relatively new term called crimmigration. Crimmigration is a convergence between civil immigration law and criminal law and policing, putting immigration enforcement really in the hands of police. The second is a focus on unauthorized immigrants that's understood to be facially neutral. These contemporary laws are not like laws of the past that that specifically targeted, for example, the Chinese with the Chinese Exclusion Act. They don't explicitly target racial, ethnic, or national origins groups, as did past laws, but rather the broad groups of people that are unauthorized. But despite being facially neutral and focused on documentation status, on the ground, these state and local level laws disproportionately target an entire class of people. These people are Latin Americans generally, and particularly in California, they are Mexicans. Non-criminal social characteristics are held in common by these folks, things like a language spoken or physical appearance that associate them with a particular immigration status. And I'll give you an example of Montana here on the slide. These two women are naturalized U.S. citizens. They were speaking Spanish in a gas station, and that was reason enough for a Border Patrol agent to stop them and to accuse them of being in the United States in an undocumented fashion and to detain them. So when we're talking about facially neutral, we know that it might, on the books, look facially neutral, but on the ground it has a really different effect. So there's no resource as of yet, though this would be a great dissertation idea. There's no resource as of yet that comprehensively tracks immigration legislation at the local level, but there is a resource that tracks it at the state level. So I'm going to show you what this looks like at the state level on this slide. This comes from the National Conference of State Legislatures. And as you can see, between the periods of 2005 to 2007 on this slide, there's a tenfold increase in the total number of immigration bills enacted. These are just the ones that were enacted into law, not the ones that weren't passed into law. The laws that make up these bars can fairly easily be sorted into two buckets. There's a restrictive bucket, and these kinds of laws seek to reduce the rights and benefits for immigrants, especially undocumented immigrants, to make their lives difficult, often with the goal of attrition or self-deportation, pushing people out. On the flip, on the other bucket, there are laws that try to do the reverse, that expand rights and benefits for all immigrants, including those who are undocumented, with the goal of integrating them into the social fabric. And so this leads to what some scholars have called a multi-jurisdictional patchwork, multi-layered jurisdictional patchwork. I like the term patchwork because you can really see how the federal, state, county, and city levels of immigration law kind of stitch together to form, in this case, a map that looks wildly different if you're, for example, in the state of California, where we are now, to if you're in the state of Texas, for example, or Kansas or Missouri. This slide is just one example of what this patchwork might look like, and it shows county policies on assisting immigration enforcement. And so on the bottom you have a local policy spectrum where the red is where jurisdictions are spending substantial amounts of local time and resources on immigration enforcement. And then the green is jurisdictions that have the most comprehensive protections against that to prevent local resources and time going into immigration enforcement. So it probably won't surprise many of you in the room that California is the greenest spot on the map here. But as I'll discuss in a moment, there's a lot of variation in California at the local level, at the city level. And so we'll talk about that in just a minute. So let me tell you a little bit about what the scholarship says about subnational immigration law. A lot of the scholarship lies on the left-hand side of this slide that looks at what the law is. There are scholars, especially legal scholars, who struggle with normative questions around what the federal government should be doing and what state and local governments should be doing. Questions around federalism and where these measures rightfully lie, in which kind of policy territory. There's also a lot of scholarship from political scientists that look at the direction of these policies. They ask, well, why do some cities and some states pass restrictive policies? Why do some pass accommodating policies? Why do some not dip their toe into this policy arena at all? And here, kind of the key variables that they look at are demographic change, is that driving things, and partisanship, along with political entrepreneurs that kind of ride the coattails of immigration to the ballot box. My concern isn't so much with what the law is, but with what the law does. And in this area of research, there's some work on the users of law, the role that non-immigrant actors, people like bureaucrats, police officers, street-level bureaucrats play. And I focus in this sense on the receivers of law. These are undocumented immigrants themselves who are confronting the consequences and the weight of their illegality, the lack of documentation status daily. So this kind of brings us directly to theories of assimilation, also known as incorporation or integration. And here I'm referring to theoretical frameworks that help us understand the processes by which members of immigrant groups and host societies come to resemble one another over time. There's really major differences between the stuff that would fall under the left-hand side of the slide here and the right-hand side of the slide, because classical models of assimilation focus on straight-line convergence, where immigrants become more similar to U.S.-born majorities over time in terms of norms, values, and behaviors. These were reworked to grapple with divergent trajectories in the post-1965 immigration flows, and to distance them from some of the very normative assumptions within the original classical models. Newer models talk about uneven or bumpy line convergence, and they focus much more on structure and context of reception. And so this is where some of my work lies. And what I try to do in the book is use the literature on passing to bridge the relationship between restrictive subnational immigration laws and these revised models of assimilation. So passing, as we know from our friend Irving Goffman, famous sociologist, passing happens when minority groups are oppressed or subject to discrimination, and then they react by attempting to lose that stigma and become absorbed into a powerful majority. This is a proactive crossing of boundaries of highly stigmatized identities. In the U.S., when we talk about passing, it's typically associated with race, with African Americans seeking to pass as white. And in relating this concept to undocumented immigrants, I'm looking at legal passing. And legal passing is an invisible trait. By looking at me, you can't know if I was born in the United States, so I'm a citizen, if I'm a naturalized citizen, if I'm a green card holder, if I'm undocumented, if I have DACA, if I hold any number of visas. You don't know that about me because it's an invisible status. So you might have some ideas based on what I look like, how I talk, and my background. Even though legal status is an invisible trait, as I suggested, some particular appearances are associated with undocumented status, and in fact this is written into the black letter of the law thanks to a Supreme Court ruling in 1975. This ruling looked at what factors Border Patrol agents could use when they decide to pull someone over or to ask someone about their legal status. Border Patrol agents have purview to do this, to stop you, ask you about your status, and search you within a 100-mile zone of any land or maritime border. And that includes almost 2/3 of all U.S. populations when you look at that land and maritime border. So right here, right now, it also includes Chicago because the Lake Michigan is considered a maritime border. So this ruling in 1975 was trying to set up the parameters around what criteria the Border Patrol could use to figure out who they were going to stop, who they were going to ask their immigration status. And the Supreme Court said that Border Patrol agents could use, I'm quoting now, Mexican appearance when they decide whom to pull over, as long as that isn't the only factor. Reasonable suspicion that a car would contain undocumented immigrants could include, and I'm quoting again, mode of dress and haircut by which officers can, quote, recognize the appearance of persons who live in Mexico. So mode of dress and haircut. So I'm going to ask somewhat sillily here with an interviewee. He's holding up a mask that's traditional to his sending locale. How one then hides such Mexican appearance and passes. We know from Irving Goffman that passing involves a really careful presentation of self, a curated presentation of self, where your words, your gestures, your physical appearance can offer up the cues that you want to show the world about who you are and who you're not. So for undocumented immigrants living in restrictive receiving locales, passing is a reactive and strategic effort to obscure a lack of authorization status in an environment with a really heightened threat of deportation. But over time, these passing behaviors become internalized and they contribute to an assimilation that's coercive and prompted by threat, and pushes undocumented immigrants to surveil themselves, surveil their children, and others in the community. That was a long wind-up. Now I'm going to tell you a little bit about the data that I collected and some of the findings. So the research comes from a 2-year mixed methods study in these 2 cities, Escondido, California, and Santa Ana, California. Is anyone in the room from these places? Or anyone from Orange County, which is where Santa Ana is? Or anyone from San Diego County, which is where, okay, great. So maybe these places sound familiar to those of you that are nearby or are California born. These cities are 70 miles away from each other, so not so far away from each other. And what I do by looking at these cities is I compare undocumented immigrant life in a city with a slew of restrictive immigration laws, that's Escondido, the point further south, with a city with a stream of accommodating immigration laws in Santa Ana, slightly further north. What I'm trying to do with this comparative case study is tease out the effects of locality and local level law. I'm selecting cities within California because, as you've seen on other slides, state-level immigration policy is really important, so we're holding that constant by picking 2 cities that are in the same state. I'm selecting cities that are geographically close, that are also both working class, mid-sized inland communities near major cities, and that are on average poorer and more racially and ethnically diverse than the affluent coastal cities that they neighbor. And most importantly, in picking these cities, this is the point of contrast, they have long enacted, strikingly divergent local immigration legislation. So let me show you a bit about what that looks like. All right. There's a lot to say here, so much that like my arrow, I had to cut off my arrow at some point. So I'll just sort of give you some of the greatest hits here of restrictions in Escondido and accommodations in Santa Ana. Escondido is probably most well known, at least in the circles that I know, for restricting rental housing for undocumented immigrants as an effort to push people out. They did that in 2006, following a similar ordinance in Hazleton, Pennsylvania. The police department in Escondido has also worked really closely with ICE, Immigration and Customs Enforcement. This is the agency that's responsible for detecting, detaining, and deporting undocumented immigrants. What Operation Joint Effort does, it was established in 2010, no memorandum of agreement. It was at first a trial program that then became formalized. And it placed ICE officers in the police department in Escondido. At the height of Operation Joint Effort, there were 12 ICE officers placed in the police department who went out with police officers on their daily beats, who were present at driver's license and DUI checkpoints, who were on police officers' cell phones, so they could just quickly text or call up their buddy and ask them to come over and check the immigration status of someone in a car or on the street corner that they might have stopped. Operation Joint Effort was in place from 2010 to 2018, and Escondido didn't voluntarily walk away from the program. Rather, in 2018, SB 54 in California became effective. SB 54 is the Values Act, and it mandated that California law enforcement couldn't use resources to investigate or arrest people based on immigration status. So this is a tension not between the federal government and states and localities, but between the state of California and a city within its jurisdiction, right? So Escondido had to walk away from Operation Joint Effort in 2018. And when it did, The former mayor of that city stated that joint effort contributed to the deportation of over 2,700 residents since its initiation. That averages out to 28 people that were deported out of that community per month in those 8 years that Operation Joint Effort was in place. I mentioned SB 54 because it's also an example of this discord between the state and localities in the opposite direction, in the direction of Santa Ana, because Santa Ana, along with 35 other California cities, have supported variations of sanctuary in their own jurisdictions and assumably supporting SB 54. Santa Ana has implemented a series of accommodating measures on a wide range of topics. It's allowed consular ID cards to be accepted as a form of ID for the police department. The police department has also put in place a policy that reduces the impounding of unlicensed drivers' cars, many of whom were undocumented immigrants. And in 2016, it passed a really robust sanctuary city ordinance that also put into place a legal defense fund for undocumented immigrants so that they could have access to to lawyers, essentially. So you'll see here scenes outside the city halls of these places. The one on the left, Santa Ana had just passed that sanctuary ordinance I mentioned. The one on the right, Escondido, had just passed the bar on renting houses to undocumented immigrants that I mentioned slightly earlier. This is not to paint these cities too broadly or too simplistically, but rather to say that when we pair these cities together and we look at them over time, they present really clearly contrasting socio-legal environments for undocumented residents of these cities. And so I'm asking, again, the research question of how these local level laws affect undocumented immigrants' everyday lives, and then what's the connection between those effects and incorporation processes. I'm answering this particular question in the book with interviews, qualitative interviews, and observations. I'm glad to talk more in detail around selection here, but let me just give you some of the highlights. I did 94 interviews with undocumented Mexican immigrants across both of these field sites. I selected similar subjects across these sites to isolate the effect of local policy as much as possible. And I did that by holding constant social class as much as I could, by selecting people that had similar levels of educational attainment and household income. I also centered on undocumented immigrants from Mexico because they're estimated to comprise the majority of the undocumented population in both of these places. I picked only people who had lived in both of these places for at least a year to guarantee that they had sufficient exposure. And I should mention that most of my sample came from rural communities of origin in Mexico. After interviews, I engaged in some ethnographic shadowing observations. So the idea here was to understand what people told me in interviews with what I could see them doing in everyday life. So these were day-long observations of undocumented immigrants' everyday life, and it gave me this interactional data where I could try to sort of triangulate what I was seeing them do with what they told me about in their interviews. I did fewer of these. I can't remember even how many I've done. I did fewer of these in the interviews, in part because it was difficult to shadow somebody throughout the course of their whole day, right? And so oftentimes these observations were done on people's days off because doing it in the workplace would have been too much of an obstruction for them and for their employers. So let me shift now to my findings. As I've suggested, engaging in everyday activities, things that we all have to do, going to get groceries, dropping kids off at school, heading to the laundromat, in hostile destinations like Escondido, meant that people were engaging in legal passing. They were literally embodying the knowledge about people in their destination on the front stage of their public persona. Of course, looking American, in air quotes there, means different things to different people. But adopting that culture of that dominant population fell into at least three primary clusters: behavioral, material, and mental adaptation. So I'm going to walk you through what I mean by all three of these. So here we have some representative examples of behavioral adaptation from these qualitative interviews. So how people moderate or shift their behavior to try to go undetected or unnoticed. The first comes from Ramon. He was married with 3 children and age 38 when I interviewed him. And he emphasized a lot in his interview the importance of a calm presentation of self. He said, If I pull up to a traffic light and it turns out I have a police car next to me, I don't look over at them. I don't move my hands, ladder my eyes. I can't look nervous because they'll come after me. And it's the nervousness that they notice in people, and that's why you get stopped and ICE gets called. So this might sound familiar to a lot of us when we're interacting with law enforcement, when you're trying to re-enter the United States with a passport. You have this little moment of like, hope everything's kosher here, hope everything's good, hope there's no problems, right? But I want to suggest that this adjustment of behavior, in particular this adjustment of body language, goes far beyond maintaining a calm demeanor. And this point is made by Jaime, another person that I interviewed in Escondido. He made this point about the way he walks, literally the gait that he uses back home in his sending community and in the United States in Escondido. He said, back home, maybe you're just taking a stroll, walking without any necessary purpose, or you're going to get something at the store and you end up chatting with someone in the plaza. But here, people always have a reason for where they're going and they want to get there fast. You can't just wander about in Escondido, it makes you look suspicious. This point was reiterated by another person that I interviewed, Alfredo. He said, you have to act fearless, act American, and walk around the streets as if you were from here. Alfredo was one of the people that I could do a day-long observation of. He was okay with that. And so when we started off our observation, I met up with him at his apartment, and we were going to walk to a local park where he was going to play a pickup soccer game. And this statement that he had said to me about acting fearless and acting American had really stuck with me. So I wanted to ask him about that as we walked to the park. It was maybe like a 15-minute walk. And so I was, I'll tell on myself here, I was a bad ethnographer. I was not paying attention to him. I was searching through my bag, looking for my sunglasses and my notebook as I asked him this question about, like, what does it mean to be fearless and act American? And he was like, you should look at me. And so I did. And the way he was presenting himself, the way he was walking, was really upright. His shoulders were back. He was striding down the street. And the vibe that he was giving off, the persona that he was giving off, the energy that he was giving off was, I have every right to be here. I know exactly where I'm going. There's absolutely no reason you should stop me. I'm just cruising on the way to my destination. He wasn't giving off any sense of cowering, physically kind of scrunching down into himself, or looking concerned, nervous, or unsure of where he was going. That, for Alfredo, was looking fearless and acting American. I want to shift now to material adaptation. So some people change their behaviors, and people also change the things that they consume. So examples of material adaptation, again from qualitative interviews. The first comes from Pedro. He was 29 when I interviewed him, a single guy who was working in construction. And he explained the importance of appearance that was emphasized through dress. Pedro said, you need to look presentable and well-dressed. If immigration or the police see you looking dirty, they'll pick you up. But if they see you looking nice, going to the store with clean shoes and everything, they'll say, okay, maybe this guy's from here. So you can imagine someone who has constrained income and needing to spend that constrained income on maybe a pair of shoes that they don't really need because they feel like that will help them legally pass, versus spending that income on something that they maybe really do need, like paying a light bill or buying groceries. Another example of this comes from Lorena. Lorena is an outlier in my research because she is actually a green card holder. She's a legal permanent resident. And she's married to someone who's undocumented. So I met Lorena, and originally I met her because I had known from a friend in common that her husband was undocumented, so I met her and I thought, maybe she would help me be able to interview her husband. But I ended up interviewing her. I also interviewed her husband, which I'll tell you about in a minute. She provided this really fascinating way of thinking about presentation of self through clothing. Her husband works as a landscaper. And, after a long day in the sun with a leaf blower, she was worried about the way he looked on his way home, being dirty, looking like a landscaper on his way home, and that he would be stopped. And so every morning, she packs a change of clothes for him so that he wears khakis and a dress shirt on his way home rather than that dirty landscaping uniform, literally changing his clothes into a white-collar type of uniform. And Lorena said, well, maybe it means nothing, but I think he calls less attention to himself with the clean clothes. So turning now from material to mental adaptation. I've talked about sustaining changes in your behavior. I've just talked a little bit about changes in what you might consume and material things that you might have on your person, or the kind of car you might drive. And along with those changes comes mental adaptation. And this is where the ways of navigating restrictive spaces begin to feel normal, routine, even accepted. The first example of this comes from Alondra. She was married, a mom of 2 and 43 when I interviewed her. She had lived in Escondido for about 7 years. She had described her attempts to pass during everyday life, and then she took a moment and kind of reflected on what the meaning of that passing was for her. And she said, it's like putting on a seatbelt when you get into a car. And when she said that, a light bulb went off for me, because I'm looking at faces here. Many of you all are probably too young to remember when you didn't automatically put on a seatbelt when you got into a car. But I remember when we started ticketing people for not wearing seatbelts in a car, and everybody started putting their seatbelts on, right? And it's become, having lived on both of those periods of that line, a really automatic thing for me. Now I get into a car, and even if it's a Lyft or a taxi, I put my seatbelt on. But that wasn't always the case. And for Alondra, this wasn't always the case either, but she said it's like putting on a seatbelt when you get into a car. I don't think about it anymore, I just do it. It was funny telling you about it, this legal passing, because I've gotten so used to doing these things that I don't think about them. This acting American has just been part of who I am. The second example comes from Pancho. So Pancho is the landscaper who's married to Lorena. Pancho's undocumented, and he is the husband. And eventually I got to interview him too. And I asked him specifically about what it means to him that Lorena every day gives him this bag with the change of clothes that he puts on in the afternoon, what that practice meant to him. And when I asked him that, he first talked about the efficacy of it. Like, does this work? Does this make police not stop me? It would be a really hard empirical question to answer. But then he talked about how, regardless, it's become a comfortable, almost tender daily moment between him and his wife, where she's expressing to him, I love you and I care about you and I want you to do this because I worry about you. And he accepts the clothes and says, I will do this for you because I know you love me and care about me. And then she blesses him and they embrace, and then he's off on the day. So this moment of forced change, right, has also created a moment of closeness in a married couple. Pancho said, I don't know if it works. Does dressing this way keep the police from stopping me? I don't know. But I do feel more comfortable, more confident driving home in these clothes because I look like someone from here, and I'm used to it now, and it's become part of our routine. So here again, I'm emphasizing the point that this legal passing, this adaptation of behavior, of material consumption, and then of mental shifts has become internalized for these undocumented migrants residing in this restrictive receiving locale. So what lessons can we take from that? We could conclude that passing is not a full incorporation of the dominant culture into the inner self. We might think about passing similar to the concept of situational ethnicity. And this is where we engage in ethnic presentations of self, kind of like a light switch, turning them on and off, knowing when they serve us in a particular situation. It's similar to the idea of code switching. But what I'm claiming in the book is that passing actually does have an assimilatory effect because it incrementally forces this adaptation that becomes internalized. It's not just this conscious moving back and forth between identities, but rather internalized, which speaks to the literature on embodiment and how practice leads to belief. Famous 14th century, I think, philosopher Pascal said, if you don't believe in God, kneel and you shall believe. If you practice enough, you will become a believer, right? And I'm drawing kind of from that idea. But that's just an assertion, so I want to check that assertion with the data that I have. And I do 2 analysis checks of that argument. The first is I ask, does legal passing continue when undocumented Mexicans leave Escondido, the restricted locale? And the second, I'm finally bringing in Santa Ana back into the picture here, is legal passing central to the navigation of daily life for undocumented Mexicans in Santa Ana, which offers a far more welcoming, inclusive, socio-legal environment. So let me tell you the logic about the first check here. The idea is that asking whether passing continues when undocumented immigrants leave Escondido for work, for leisure, for any number of reasons, continues. The logic here would be is if passing is only immediately related to that restrictive environment in Escondido, we would expect presentation of self to change once people leave that city limit, assuming that they're traveling to a place that's more socio-legally welcoming. But the data that I've collected from immigrants that travel outside of Escondido, which everyone does, show that passing is an ingrained, internalized behavior, and it carries over city lines. And I saw this on these ethnographic observations as well. An example of this comes from Julia, who's a single mom of 31 years old. She said, "It doesn't matter if I'm cleaning houses in Del Mar, which is a very affluent coastal community, or buying groceries in Escondido. I still fit in, look like I'm from here, and I don't draw attention to myself." Maribel was 32. She said, "I could be in Escondido or anywhere. I always dress this way so no one thinks I don't have papers. It's become part of my style." And Maribel had a very particular style that she called her California style, and it was a very Southern California style. She wore short shorts, she had big hair, she always wore sunglasses, she always wore flip-flops. That's what made her feel like she was kind of masking her documentation status and fitting in to a particular kind of subset of young people in San Diego area. So the second check here is Santana, the accommodating case. The logic here is that if passing in Escondido and its related adaptations in behavior, material consumption, and mental adaptation is prompted by that restrictive context of the receiving locale, then we would expect to see a really different navigation of daily life from undocumented residents of Santana, being such a much more welcoming space. And here my fieldwork confirms this, but with some caveats. There's always a but. So I want to say that within Santana, presentation of self and image management is of course present for undocumented immigrants. It's present for all of us. I'm engaging with it with you all right now. Right? We all present ourselves in particular ways in particular spaces, and for undocumented people in Santana, that's no different. But in Santana, this is manifest with behavioral adaptations that are focused on appearing law-abiding to avoid fines and inconvenience, rather than avoiding deportation. And those are really different. They're both bad, right? Fines and inconvenience are a bummer, but it's a completely different category than the threat of deportation. They're not attempts to pass. They're not leading to the kinds of material and mental shifts that I see for immigrants in Escondido. They're focused squarely on this behavioral adaptation. So let me give you some examples of what I mean. Javier had been in Santana for 6 years when I interviewed him, and he said, "I act calm and not nervous when I'm driving. The police don't give us too many problems, but I just don't have the money to pay for tickets and I don't have a license." So it's more like, I don't want to get a ticket, so I'm gonna obey the speed limit, use my blinker. But there wasn't this pervading fear of deportation. Another came from Ana, who is a single mother. She worked in a Santana warehouse, had been there for about 4 years when I interviewed her. And when I asked her about navigation of daily life there, she said, "I have family in other cities where, yes," she had family in Arizona. "I have family in other cities where, yes, they speak Spanish they don't speak Spanish on the street and they dress in a certain way, but there's no need for that here. It's more relaxed here. The most you do is drive the speed limit and stay calm." So I want to wind up with just a couple of implications, and then I'm really interested in chatting with you all on Q&A. So what I'm arguing here, and what I try to develop throughout the length of the book, this is sort of chapter 5 of the book, but what I'm arguing across the arc of the book is that local immigration laws shape immigrants' lives and their incorporation trajectories from their physical navigation of space, to their perceptions of police, to their presentation of self, to their sense of membership, and even to their parenting. So I have a chapter in the book where I talk about passing down legal passing, where parents teach their children about these practices. So there's several implications of this argument. I'm just going to pull out a few that I hope might be of interest. One is recasting the in the shadows narrative. I think that this narrative does nobody any service. It reduces this rich social world that immigrants and all of us really live in into a flat caricature. And it takes away the agency of immigrants that I'm highlighting in this book by showing how people navigate even these very restrictive spaces. It also suggests that we need to reevaluate the unit of analysis in social science studies of international migration, because typically we focus on the national level when we talk about law, and typically we focus on the national level when we talk about climate and when we talk about things like incorporation. And what I'm suggesting here is that the legal climates within immigrants' immediate destinations matter as much as, maybe more than, national level climates. This point's also relevant to boundaries. So when I'm in my work, I'm not talking just about ethnic and racial and national origins boundaries, but also these invisible boundaries of status, immigration status. And then finally, there are, I think, a slew of public policy implications. So one of the things I talk about in the book, I didn't touch on much on here, but is the idea that this idea that if you just restrict immigrants, undocumented immigrants enough, they'll kind of throw up their hands and leave and go to more welcoming spaces or return home. That attrition through enforcement doctrine, the self-deportation doctrine, isn't working. We have not seen people flood out of places like Arizona or Oklahoma, which had the biggest, baddest anti-immigrant bill before Arizona's passed. We haven't seen people flood out of Escondido. We do see dips in, for example, school attendance. That doesn't mean people are leaving. It just means they're staying home for a while. And after the threat kind of dissipates, people go back to their everyday routines. So if we know that attrition through enforcement isn't pushing people out, we also might think about assimilation under threat being a particularly undesirable outcome of these restrictions. It's undesirable because other modes of incorporation remain blocked: educational incorporation, socioeconomic incorporation, and because in the act of legal passing, immigrants are perpetuating and extending the exclusionary logics behind restrictive local level immigration laws, and it's affecting their well-being. And well-being is a different thing than incorporation and assimilation. Well-being is looking at whether immigrants are better or worse off over time. Not whether they're better, not whether they're more or less similar to US-born people, right? So it's affecting their well-being over time, which affects everyone. If you don't care about immigrants, you can think about that effect for everyone within a community. On the flip, I'm arguing in the book that more accommodating approaches allow undocumented immigrants to be part of the society as they are, who they are, and that accommodations do a better job of building communities that value all members. And then again, if you don't have a particular interest in undocumented people or immigrants in your community, you might think about how that valuing of people within the community, everyone within the community, does service for the well-being of civil society at large. So I'll end there with another thanks for the opportunity to come here and chat with you all about my work. I'm looking forward to your questions. Should I field them? Yeah.
I'll throw one out. What did you learn about the sources of strategies for passing? Family members, friends, something else?
Yeah, so you're saying how did people learn to legally pass?
Yeah.
Typically what happens in Mexican-U.S. migration flows is that people the immigrants don't go to places where they don't have anybody that they know, right? It's either somebody from a family member, however close or distant, right? Second, third cousin, or sister, brother, or somebody from their hometown that they know already. So when people migrate, they're joining communities of folks that they know already. And so that not only connects people with resources like places to live and potential opportunities on the labor market, information around like how to enroll your kid in school, but also with information about legal passing, also information about how to distinguish what a police car looks like from what a Border Patrol car looks like, from what an ICE officer's car might look like. Tells them information like ICE officers wear jackets that say police, but they're not police, they're ICE officers. Right, so all of this information is passed through essentially the answer is social networks. Yeah. Yes?
Thank you for a great presentation, very well put together. I'm wondering if you can elaborate a bit on parenting and legal passing, particularly around mixed status families, if you interviewed them.
I'm sorry, say the part of your question again, parenting?
Parenting
Okay.
and legal passing, like what is the information that is passed down to the next generation, and what does it look like in terms of mixed status families?
Yeah. So the mixed status families, I should say the caveat is I only interviewed adults, but in interviewing adults, I was oftentimes in people's homes. And so I got to see interactions between parents and children. And I initially, I'll just say this in the spirit of being completely transparent with some of the stumbles in my fieldwork. I initially conceived of this project as just interviewing immigrants as individuals and not thinking about them as embedded in families. That was an error. And it was an error that was brought to me in sort of ways that I wouldn't have expected, because it turns out that I was pregnant while I was doing a lot of this field work. And then I had a baby with me when I was doing the rest of it. And so that naturally prompted conversations around kids and families that helped me think about people, legal passing in a more family-based context. So that's the way I came to even think about it in the first place. For mixed status families, of which there were many in my work, I draw a lot from the work of Joanna Dreby, who talks about how immigration status in the family level context often falls down to the lowest common denominator of the person who's undocumented. So if there's one person in your immediate family who's undocumented, most of the family members in that family unit, even if they're U.S.-born citizens or naturalized or hold any other kind of documentation status, will experience the life of someone who's undocumented, that they all kind of cluster around the most vulnerable status. When parents talked about how they pass down legal passing to their kids, it went from everything from the name that they chose to give their child before they were born, to the ways that they told their kid to walk home from school. So I'll give you examples from both of what I just said. There was a woman that I interviewed whose name was Jimena, spelled with an X, and her boss could not pronounce her name, and he called her Zena, and she hated that. And when she had her son with another undocumented person from Mexico, but someone who spoke English really well and had been in the United States for a really long time, who qualified for DACA but just never applied, he gave his wife a hard time a lot because she couldn't really speak English and she had a very thick accent when she did. And when they became pregnant with their son, they decided to name him a really typical U.S. name. And it turns out they actually gave him the name of the boss who couldn't pronounce Jimena's name. So that was, in utero, legal passing happening. The other example that comes to mind, just to be brief, is a family that had 3 kids, 2 of whom were born in the U.S., one of whom was undocumented, crossed at an early age, who held DACA. And the parents told all 3 of the children that they wanted them to walk home from school through the alley rather than walk on the street corner, because this was an area where there were a lot of DUI checkpoints at sort of the height of Operation Joint Effort, where ICE was working with the police. But the problem is the alley had a lot of gang activity. And it wasn't really a safe place there's 3 girls, it wasn't really a safe place for them to walk home from elementary and middle school on their own. And the parents were sort of pushed between a rock and a hard place in telling their kids that they should walk on a street, public street, where there was a lot of ICE activity, or walk in an alley where there was a lot of gang activity. That was the decision that the parents were grappling with. And that's the kind of legal passing behaviors that they were pushing down to their kids. Children, and again, I did not interview systematically children, but when parents talked about how their children reacted to their kind of passing down this legal passing, they sort of clustered into 2 groups. There were the children who did it automatically and religiously, like the putting on the seatbelt metaphor, and then there were the children who pushed back and said, they were sort of more of the undocumented and unafraid background, who pushed back against their parents, tried to talk to their parents about having rights and having the ability to be who they were, be open about their status. And parents really grappled with their children who pushed back, because the parents were thinking that they were keeping the children safe, right? And so when the children engaged in, for example, protests or marches around Operation Joint Effort, one mom told me, I feel like I'm watching him walk in front of a speeding car and I can't stop him, because she was that nervous about her child walking out and declaring that he was undocumented and unafraid.
I'm trying to better understand why these immigrants don't move to locations that are friendlier to them. And you mentioned that they usually move where they already know somebody or have a family. But initially they moved from Mexico. They had to cross the very difficult. They had to make very difficult crossing. And there was a lot of sacrifice they had to do. And now, going from Escondido to Santa Ana, it's much easier. And so, looking at the cost-benefit analysis, it seems like the cost, the benefit for them from moving to Santa Ana isn't as big as the cost would be.
Mm-hmm. That's a great question. And I think you hit the nail on the head with the cost-benefit analysis, which sort of goes to whether or not we're all kind of rational actors or if we act based on other things. And so it's not just a cost-benefit analysis. It's a question of settlement and becoming embedded in a community, even one that's pushing you out. So, for example, when I asked this question to people in Escondido, they would say, I really like my kid's school. Or, we just bought a washing machine. Or, I know everybody in this apartment building. And so it's difficult to pick up, as difficult as it is, to pick up from a home community, from the place you were born, and migrate to the United States. It's also difficult to pick up from a place where you have a job, you know some people, you know how to navigate, you know where the grocery store is, you know where the grocery store that sells your favorite brand of X thing is, and you know the aisle where to find it. It's hard to pick up and leave that and go to another place, particularly if there's not people in that other place that you know that can help you get your kid enrolled in school, get a job, so on and so forth. One way that I tried to look at this in the book is actually drawing from some different data, from survey data. So not the Escondido-Santa Ana comparison, but rather a comparison with immigrants from a sending community in Yucatan, in the state of Yucatan in Mexico. It's a relatively new sending community, so it's in its first wave of migration. That means that most people are undocumented who migrate. They haven't, been here for a long time to get legalized through IRCA, for example. And about half of those people go to the Bay Area, and about half of those people go to Oklahoma. So when we were collecting survey data from these migrants, we have surveys on all of their life history, so we know every place that they've lived, right? And when I realized that there was a split between U.S. destinations, I started to look into Oklahoma a little bit more, because I already knew what was happening in San Francisco and California around immigration policy. I started looking into Oklahoma, and Oklahoma passed, as I mentioned before, one of the biggest anti-immigrant laws statewide just prior to Arizona's SB 1070 that did a slew of restrictions. And so I thought, well, this is a natural experiment. If Oklahoma's bill, HB 1804, pushes people out, we should see people from the sending community in Yucatan going to the Bay Area because they have people there. Right? They have community members there, they have family members there. There's a community to join. It's not just go back to Mexico, right? There's a community to join. But what we found when we looked at the survey data was actually that after Oklahoma's 2008 bill, the population of undocumented migrants from the sending locale in Yucatan went up in Oklahoma. People left the Bay Area to move to Oklahoma. Why? It's expensive here, right? And there's a lot of labor market saturation in the niche jobs that these people work in. And in Oklahoma, there was a lot of work. The cost of life was cheaper. And there was an ethnic community to join. So I think that especially lawmakers kind of pass these laws and think that people will automatically leave because it's restrictive, or everybody will flock to California where it's accommodating. And we simply know that's not how it shakes out in people's decisions around residency and settlement.
Yeah, that was my question about the one way to put a pressure on the local municipalities. If the immigrants leave and there will be nobody to do those jobs that they were doing, maybe that's kind of like a free market solution to to realize that by passing those laws they are hurting themselves.
Mm-hmm.
But my second question is, I'm going to play a devil's advocate a little bit. Like, the laws are supposedly enacted for betterment of society, so the society is better off with the laws in place. So if somebody kind of adopts or follows the laws to the letter, or maybe we can call it legal passing in terms of I'm going to be very aware of laws that have in my life. That it may be a good thing, for these people. That it might benefit them maybe later in life because they stay out of trouble because they are more aware of all these little traps or how to avoid attention.
So I respond to that in a couple of ways. I think the first thing I would say is that we have to make a difference, as I mentioned sort of at the close, between assimilation or incorporation and well-being. And I would be hard convinced to believe that being forced to legally pass would be conducive to someone's well-being. I would also say that we know from a slew of social science research that immigrants and undocumented immigrants commit crimes at far lower rates than U.S. citizens. And in fact, in the second and third and fourth generation of migration, people have assimilated to our criminal ways and are committing crimes at the same rates as people that don't have an immigration history. So I am truly hard-pressed to see any upside. I appreciate the devil's advocate kind of spirit, but I'm truly pressed to see an upside to this because it's negative for immigrants who are community members, right? And so if you think about everything that you touch in your day or that your family touches in your day, it might be the healthcare system, the educational system, the criminal justice system, all of these different kind of systems that we're all embedded in. If you think about touching those systems because you have to, as someone who is forced to act in a particular way and hide parts of who they are, I don't see an uptick. I don't see a benefit.
I mean, you already mentioned the benefit was that there is less crime by undocumented immigrants.
But that's not because of legal passing.
No?
Yeah.
No.
Both groups, because the Senate and the folks weren't breaking the law.
Right, yeah. That's not because of legal passing at all. It's because people are working and people aren't, we can't assume that a group has more criminal tendencies than another based on documentation status, right?
Can you just talk a little bit about how you built relationships with the people you were interviewing and how they were able to trust and open up to you about their experiences?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I'll say again, this was not on purpose, but winding up pregnant did a lot for me in that regard. Because there's nothing less intimidating than someone who's 9 months pregnant. You're fully vulnerable. You don't look like the police. You don't look like someone who's coming to do bad things to people, right? And there's an instant point of connection for other people who are parenting or even people that are not parenting, right? So it turns out that worked to my benefit. In fact, I remember I was, I didn't talk about this, but I also did a lot of attendance at public meetings and city council meetings and public protests. And so I was at a protest in Escondido against Operation Joint Effort. And, we were marching towards a police station and the red light changed. So we were stopped at a corner. And one of the organizers started yelling, El que nos migra. Oh, el que no brinca es migra. The person who doesn't jump up and down is migra, is ICE enforcement. And I couldn't jump. And I remember being what should I do? Because I don't want these people to think, And everybody around me realized the quandary that I was in, and it just sort of helped embed me into the community in ways that I could not have expected. And so that was really helpful. I also had, I'll just talk about sort of strategies for doing snowball sampling in both of these places. I was connected to undocumented communities in both Escondido and Santa Ana from organizing work and from work that I did just in the area. And so one of the things that helped me was to begin there with contacts that I already had. But of course, that's a convenient sample that cannot be, that can lead to some problems because you're only sampling from people that you know, right? So then after I did that, I went to local notables in the community. So these were pastors and priests, teachers, other folks that were embedded in the community who knew a lot of people. I asked them. And then finally, as I started doing interviews, I was often in spaces where there were just a lot of undocumented people. So at a birthday party or at a pickup soccer game or at particular apartment complexes have a lot of undocumented families. And so in the common spaces in those areas, I met people got to know me, and that's how I did sampling to try to make sure that I was avoiding just sampling from one snowball, but having multiple snowballs going on at the same time. Sure.
Was there anything interesting in terms of who agreed to be observed versus not?
Yeah, it was way harder to do the observations. I had initially conceived of doing the observations with people at work when it was possible, like not in a restaurant scenario because being in the kitchen would have been like in the way. But I felt like maybe in a landscaping scenario would have worked, or with people who cleaned houses. But in general, people were unwilling to have me observe them while they were at work, and I think that's because they were worried about losing their jobs and about sort of flagging themselves, like, who is this? How are they going to explain my presence, right? And so that I only observed a couple of people at work. One was the pair that I started from at the very beginning, Barbara and Luz. They ran their own sort of house cleaning operation, and so there was no sort of employer to be worried about, and they always cleaned houses when people were out, so there were no owners of homes to be worried about. But in general, I observed people on their days off, which meant I didn't get to see them when they interacted at work. And so to circumvent not being able to observe that, oftentimes I would ride with people to their places of work. So at least I could capture how they got to work. So there's an excerpt in the book where I talk about riding with one guy to his work at a restaurant, and we were kind of, driving down the street, and then all of a sudden, and all of you have probably had this happen to you, you stop at a stoplight, and there's a cop car next to you. And I just thought to myself, okay, and I didn't want to look at the driver. I was in the passenger seat, so I just tried to stay calm. And I saw, though, out of the corner of my eye, how his hands clenched the steering wheel. Like, I remember seeing the whiteness on his knuckles. And then the light changed, and the police car just sped forward, and he turned right, which was not the way to the restaurant. Yeah. But he turned right to avoid any kind of possibility that he would come across that police officer again, so we took a much more roundabout way to get to work. And then when we arrived at his workplace, we spent a couple of minutes debriefing in the car about what that was like and what he was thinking. So those were some obstacles that I came across. There's no way to be a fly on the wall. You are physically, your body is there, you're present. And so, as I started getting pushback from people about like, I'm not comfortable doing this in my place of work, I really had to think about making sure that I wasn't putting anybody at risk by offering or by asking them to be observed in this way.
Thank you for an amazing talk and just for bringing these issues to light. And I wonder if you encountered anything in the data, because as I'm listening to this, the work I do, often people talk about self-presentation, the way they have to maneuver in the world that's different than they would in an intimate setting. But I wonder if you encountered anything that people talked about race or racialization, because when I think about what it means to act American, I explicitly think what it means to be white. And so I wondered if they talked about, if that's what they were sort of talking about or thinking about, or if you saw variation based on the way people looked or the way they were racialized, because obviously people can look, Latin Mexican people can pass, quote unquote, as white. And so did you see any variation there based on how people looked or their experience in the world?
Yeah, that was a great question. And so the first thing I want to say is that legal passing as a strategy works in Southern California because there's a large Latinx population that is U.S. born. And so it's not, people weren't just trying to look white, they were also trying to act and look the ways that Latinx populations who were born here look and act. I have a colleague that I wrote a paper with who does work in Montana, which is one of the whitest states in the United States, and she talks about how just by being brown in Montana, you're racialized, and you're labeled as undocumented. There's no way to legally pass in Montana. You can try, but just by being who you are, you're going to be targeted as someone who's undocumented. So I think that the demographic composition of the places where people live matter quite a lot in even this practice at all. I should also say, and I think this is a really critical point, that another piece of selection criteria that I did when I was doing sampling was I didn't include anybody in the study who self-identified as indigenous. And I didn't do that because in northern San Diego County, there's a much larger indigenous Mexican population than there is in Santa Ana, so I thought that would introduce too much noise into the data. But I also did it because I think that indigenous Mexicans are marginalized in different ways, right? And so and part of it's practical. I only speak Spanish. I don't speak any indigenous languages. But I thought that it would be setting up a comparison that wouldn't be quite right. And so I don't directly address issues of indigeneity and colorism amongst Mexican immigrants. That's not to say that everyone in my sample could pass as white, just because they didn't self-identify as indigenous, right? So, but I wouldn't say that people that could, that white passing undocumented Mexicans engaged in legal passing less than people who weren't white passing. Yeah.
Hi, thanks for your talk. I'm just reminded of the thing called embodied anthropologist. So it's saying that instead of being like a tool, so instead of for the anthropologist to be as a tool to observe things, so like anthropologists can also bring like their bodily experience and also opinion when describing the objective fact. So I was wondering if you were including any subjective opinion or experiencing when you were writing the book and stating the facts.
I mean, that's a great question. You know, as scholars, we're oftentimes encouraged to sort of erase ourselves from the narratives that we write. And that's a false representation of reality in many different ways, and it does a lot of violence to reality. So you do see a lot of me in the book, but you see me reporting what I see. Because I don't want to center myself in the book. I'm not undocumented. And so I don't share that experience. I can only report what I saw, if that makes sense. Yeah.
Since your book does focus on undocumented people, and you did mention why you didn't include indigenous people, or why you didn't include anyone that identified as Mexicans or Mexican Americans or within that within those categories, did you include any like people from like Central America or other Spanish-speaking identifying folks? Why and why not?
I didn't, in part to keep that comparison as clean as I could. But you're right. I mean, especially in Santana and Orange County, there's a big Vietnamese population. Certainly, we focus way more in immigration studies generally, but especially in this subset of studies around illegality around Mexicans versus other national origins groups. I have a student at Northwestern in Chicago who's doing this really fascinating study. So Chicago's a great place to study immigration, in part because there's a bunch of different immigrant groups. So the Southern California experience is mainly dominated by the Mexican experience, but not exclusively. But in Chicago, there's undocumented people from Russia, Poland, Ireland, along with Central America, Mexico, and a lot of groups from Africa, so the undocumented Black experience. So this student is studying variations of what it means to be undocumented amongst all of those different groups in the city of Chicago, and I'm super excited about his work because what is traveling through the world being undocumented and Irish? What does that look like? Versus traveling through the world and being undocumented and Nigerian or Mexican or El Salvadoran, right? Those are really, really critical contrasts that I don't pick up in this book. Yes?
Since you mentioned Chicago, it made me think about gender differences. When I was spending time when my son was living in Pilsen, it seemed like there was a segment of the Mexican population where the women didn't leave Pilsen and the men did some cases for work. And so there was, there was a tortilleria, it was getting gentrified on one hand, but there was also this maintenance of kind of a more country sense of connection and community. So did you see that kind of separation in strategies around gender or around, given the way people move through the world in the communities where they live?
In general, I saw gender differences clustering around men experiencing higher deportation threat than women because they were also targeted as potential gang members and criminals. Whereas women, especially women who walked down the street with children, had children as sort of this protective force. Men who walked down the street by themselves had to avoid looking undocumented and also had to avoid looking like a gang member. And so I saw a much more heightened threat around deportability and crime in general amongst men And oftentimes, men who even weren't partnered would prefer to sort of move about the space with a woman friend who had kids because they felt like that offered some realm of protection. I didn't do this extensively, so I didn't talk about it at all in the book, but in Escondido I did some ride-alongs with police to sort of try to understand how they make sense of this, and how they sort of, essentially how they racially profile people. They just asked me what I was doing, and I said I was doing dissertation research, and they didn't ask any more questions, so I just rode along with them. And one police officer in particular was just very open with his practices, and he said that he didn't want any undocumented people in the community, that he would stop them all if he could, but he didn't stop women with children because the paperwork load at the end of the night would be too much.
That's compelling.
Yeah. Yes.
So with that, unfortunately, we are out of time. So I'd like us to thank Professor Garcia for her talk.